The cell smelled like copper and old rain. That was the first thing Marcus Vale noticed when they dragged him in. Not the alien guards with their four-jointed arms and pale, lidless eyes. Not the humming amber field across the door that would stop a freight train. Not the 16 other prisoners slumped against the far wall like laundry left to dry. Just the smell. Copper and old rain and something underneath it. Something mineral and wrong, like the inside of a machine that had never been cleaned. He'd been in worse places. He kept telling himself that. He sat down against the wall, pulled his knees up, and started counting his breathing. In through the nose, out through the mouth, slow enough that his heart rate would drop. The directorate guards outside the door were Veth. He could hear the dry clicking of their secondary mandibles through the amber field, the sound they made when they were bored. Bored was good. Bored meant they weren't paying attention. 17 days since the Veth Directorate had swept the Kepler corridor and taken every human settlement they could find. 17 days since Marcus had been separated from the research team, from Dr. Osai, from the data drives that held 3 years of xenobiology fieldwork, from everything that had made any of this worth doing. He pressed the back of his head against the wall and stared at the amber field. The thing about the Veth was that they didn't particularly hate humans. That would have been almost comfortable. Hatred has logic, has grammar, has rules you can learn. The Veth were indifferent. Humans were a nuisance species that had spread too far into Directorate-claimed space, and nuisances got contained. It wasn't personal. It was administrative. Marcus found that much harder to take than hatred. Across the cell, a big man with a shaved head and a split lip caught his eye. The man gave him a slow nod, the prisoner nod, the one that says, "I see you, I'm not a threat, I'm just trying to get through this." Marcus nodded back. The man's name turned out to be Dorian Ketch, former cargo hauler, and he'd been in the cell for 9 days already, and he was the one who explained the rhythms of the place. "They feed you twice a day," Ketch said, keeping his voice low. "Paste that tastes like nothing. They take you for processing every 3 days. That's a blood draw and a scan. It doesn't hurt. They log everything. They're very thorough." "What do they do with the data?" Ketch shrugged one massive shoulder. "Census, I think. The Directorate likes knowing what it has. They're not going to hurt us, best I can tell. Just hold us until whatever treaty negotiation is happening gets sorted. Or doesn't. And if it doesn't..." Ketch looked at the wall. "I try not to think about that." Marcus thought about it constantly. He also thought about the data drives. He thought about 3 years of field research on Veth neurobiology, on the specific architectural patterns of Veth collective memory, on a discovery he had made 18 months ago that he had told exactly no one because the implications were so significant that he'd needed to be certain, absolutely certain, before he said a word to anyone. He'd been 3 weeks away from being certain. Now he was here, in a cell that smelled like copper and old rain, waiting to be processed. The processing room was white and humming. They took him on his 3rd day, 2 guards flanking him through corridors that curved like the inside of a shell. The Veth built everything on organic curves, no right angles, no hard edges, every surface a gentle arc. It should have been soothing. It wasn't. The medic waiting for him was female, he thought. The Veth had 3 biological sexes and he'd never fully mastered the visual tells, but there was something in the proportions, in the way she moved, that read as female. She was younger than the guards, her pale carapace still slightly translucent at the edges, and she wore the blue-gray sash of the Directorate Medical Corps. Her name, he would later learn, was Physician 3rd CL Varathan. She had been posted to this transit detention facility 14 months ago, and she found it, by all available evidence, insufferably dull. She gestured him to a chair, a human chair. They'd actually sourced human furniture, which struck him as simultaneously thoughtful and ominous, and began the standard intake procedure without looking directly at him. Her instruments moved over his skin with a professionalism that felt almost kind. "This is a standard biological census scan," she said, her translator rendering it in flat, accented standard. "Non-invasive. We require a blood sample. Do you consent, or do we classify you as a non-consenting detainee, which changes your processing tier?" "I consent," Marcus said. The blood draw was clean and quick. She pressed a thin instrument to the inside of his elbow and withdrew it in under 2 seconds. Then she turned to her console and ran the standard panel: blood type, pathogen screen, genetic flagging, species verification, nutrient deficiency markers, the 18-point census checklist the Directorate used for all detained biologics. Marcus sat quietly and waited. The room hummed. Ciel Varathon ran the panel, glanced at the results, frowned at the screen, ran the panel again, and then went very still. He noticed her stillness. It was the kind of stillness that humans do when they've just read something they didn't expect and they're not sure how to arrange their face. The Veth expressed it differently: a cessation of the small, constant motions of their secondary limbs, a kind of total pause, but the meaning was the same across species. Something had happened that didn't fit. "Is there a problem?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She ran the panel a third time. She pulled up a secondary console, cross-referenced something, pulled up what appeared to be a database of some kind, scrolled through it with quick gestures of 3 fingers. Her secondary limbs had gone completely still. "You are listed as," she stopped, checked again. "Occupation, research, xenobiologist, affiliated with the Kepler Corridor Science Consortium." "That's right." "Prior to detention, your most recent registered location was Survey Station Kepler 7, where you were conducting," she paused, and there was something in the pause. "Biological research." "That's right." She turned from the console and looked at him directly, which was unusual. Veth eye contact had specific social meanings, and a physician holding sustained eye contact with a detainee was not standard protocol. "What kind of biological research?" she said. Her translator was still rendering in flat, accented standard, but the flatness had changed. It was the careful flatness of someone keeping their voice deliberately neutral. Marcus looked at her. He thought about the data drives. He thought about what was on the data drives, what he had spent 3 years building toward, what he had been 3 weeks away from publishing. He thought about Physician Third Ciel Varathon, running that panel 3 times and going very still. "What did the scan show?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the console, and her fingers moved across it in a quick sequence, and the console screen went dark. "Processing is complete," she said. "You'll be returned to your cell." He was returned to his cell. He lay on his back on the floor. There were no beds, but the floor was warm. The Veth liked warm floors and stared at the ceiling and thought. He'd been afraid those first 3 days, the way you're afraid when you're trapped and the walls aren't moving, and the people who have you don't particularly care one way or another what happens to you. He'd been afraid in the flat, administrative way that's almost worse than panic, the kind of fear that settles in and gets comfortable. He wasn't afraid anymore. He was thinking. The scan had found something. The physician had gone still, had run it 3 times, had cross-referenced a database, had shut the console down rather than let him see the screen. That meant the scan had found something she didn't know what to do with, something outside her processing tier, something that was above her pay grade. He knew what it was. He'd known it for 18 months. The question was what she was going to do with it. He found out the next morning. Ketch was the one who noticed first. "Something's different," he said, watching the guards through the amber field. "They've been doing that clicking thing, the anxious one, not the bored one." "How do you know the difference?" "Been here long enough." Ketch paused. "Also, the warden came by this morning. Walked past this cell 3 times. He hasn't been on this floor in 9 days. The warden was called Administrator Grel Paz Toth, and he was a male Veth with the broad, heavily articulated shoulders of an older member of his species, and the particular posture of someone who had spent decades in bureaucratic authority. He had never looked directly at any of the human prisoners. He had the air of someone who managed a pest control operation and felt that personally acknowledging the pests would be undignified. He came to Marcus's cell 2 hours after Ketch's observation. He stood outside the amber field. He looked in. He looked specifically at Marcus, which was the first time anyone in the administrative chain of this facility had treated Marcus as an individual rather than a catalog entry. "You are Vale, Marcus J.," he said. "Species, human. Affiliation, Kepler Corridor Science Consortium. Research specialization, xenobiology." "Yes," Marcus said. "Subspecialty in Veth neural architecture." Poztov's voice had the same studied neutrality as the physician's, but underneath it was something Marcus recognized from a different context entirely, from grant committees, from departmental politics, from the faces of senior academics when a junior researcher published something that threatened to rearrange everything they knew. "Yes," Marcus said. "You were conducting research at Survey Station Kepler 7 for 3 years." "Yes." Poztov was quiet for a moment. The clicking of his mandibles was the anxious kind. Ketch had been right. "Your research," Poztov said carefully, "has not been published." "No," Marcus said, "it hasn't. The data exists where?" And there it was, the thing under the thing, the question that told Marcus exactly how much Grel Poztov had already worked out, how much CL Varathon had told him when she'd gone up the chain with whatever she'd found on that panel, how much the directorate now understood about what they were holding. "The data is on encrypted drives," Marcus said, "which are at Survey Station Kepler 7 in my lab, which your forces overran 17 days ago." Poztov looked at him for a long moment. Then he left without another word. Marcus sat back down against the wall. He was smiling. He let 3 days pass. He was not built for patience. He'd been told that his entire life, by his mother, by his thesis advisor, by the consortium board that had funded the Kepler project. Too fast, too eager, too willing to push before he was sure. It had cost him a publication once, cost him a relationship twice, cost him a year of setbacks on the Kepler project when he jumped ahead of his own data. He'd spent 3 years learning to sit with uncertainty and let it ripen. He sat with it now. On the 4th day, Physician 3rd CL Varathon came back. She came alone, without guards, which was irregular. She came at a time between shifts, which was also irregular. She stood outside the amber field and looked at him with the direct, sustained eye contact that meant something. He just wasn't sure what. "Walk with me," she said. "The field." She touched something on her wrist, and the amber field went dark. He stood up. He glanced at Ketch, who was watching with his arms very still and his face doing something complicated. Marcus gave him the nod. The one that said, "I see you, I'm not a threat, I'm just trying to get through this." Then he walked out of the cell. She took him to a small room 2 corridors away, a consultation room, white and curved and smelling of that same mineral clean scent. She sat. He sat. She pulled a thin tablet from her sash and set it on the surface between them, face down. "You know what your blood scan showed," she said. It wasn't a question. "I have a good guess," he said. "Your genetic sequence carries a specific marker. The sequence," she paused. "The sequence is one that occurs naturally in approximately 0.003% of the Veth population. It is not a coincidence of similar structure. It is an identical sequence. A marker that, in Veth biology, indicates a specific bloodline, a specific line of descent." Marcus nodded slowly. "The Veth and humans diverged," he said, keeping his voice steady, "approximately 400,000 years ago. Standard estimates put the split at 350, but my data suggests closer to 400. The divergence was not, as the dominant model assumes, a parallel evolutionary development on separate worlds. It was a migration, a population of the ancestral species, what we'd call proto-Veth, what your records probably call the progenitor, left the original homeworld, reached a new system, and adapted. Two populations, same root, 400,000 years of separate development. He looked at her. The marker in my blood is from before the split. She picked up the tablet, set it face up. On the screen was a genetic sequence diagram, complex, layered, the kind of visualization that took months to learn to read. Two sequences running parallel, with sections highlighted in amber. "This is your sequence," she said, pointing to one. "This is the sequence of the Veth sovereign line." She pointed to the other. "The highlighted sections are identical." "I know," he said. "The sovereign line is the oldest documented Veth bloodline. It predates the Directorate by 6,000 years. Under Directorate law, any individual carrying this marker, regardless of species, regardless of context, is considered to hold sovereign designation. Which means, Marcus said quietly, I can't be held as a detainee. I can't be held as anything. Under your own law, I have to be released." The room was very quiet. "The administrator," she said, "is aware of this. He has been aware of it for 3 days. He has not acted on it. He is." She stopped. "He's trying to figure out how to make the problem go away," Marcus said. She didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Is there anyone else who knows?" he asked. "I know he knows. 2 senior guards know because he had to consult someone. The records, I've been reviewing the records. Administrator Paztoth has been altering administrative logs, the processing record from your intake. He is reclassifying your census entry as incomplete. A system error. He is trying to bury it. But you still have the original scan." She looked at him. Her secondary limbs were very still. "Yes." "And you came to tell me." "I came," she said carefully, "to understand what I am dealing with. I came because I ran a panel 3 times and what I found had implications I was not prepared for, and I needed to determine whether the data was accurate. I have determined that it is. So what do you do now?" The question sat between them like something fragile. She was young, he remembered, still translucent at the carapace edges. 14 months posted here, to a facility that bored her, and now she was sitting across from a human prisoner whose blood had handed her a choice that could either end her career or define it. He'd made that kind of choice before. He knew what it felt like. "What is the rest of your research?" she said. He considered how much to give her. He considered what she'd already risked by coming here, by dropping the amber field, by sitting across this table and speaking plainly. He considered the data drives back at Kepler 7, the 3 years of work, the discovery he'd been 3 weeks away from confirming. "The migration wasn't just one way," he said. "The ancestral population that left the proto-Veth, the progenitors, they didn't leave everyone behind. There was traffic, back and forth for several thousand years before the routes became too difficult, and during that traffic there was intermingling. The populations weren't isolated. They traded genetics. That's why the marker appears in both lines." He paused. "Which means the separation between human and Veth isn't what either of us has ever been taught. We're not 2 species who happen to evolve similarly. We're one species that separated, maintained contact for thousands of years, and then lost touch." He looked at her directly. "You are not our galactic neighbors. You are our cousins. Long-separated cousins who have forgotten the family relationship, and my data proves it." The room was very quiet for a long time. "That data," she said at last, "if published would rewrite everything," Marcus said. "Every legal framework for Veth-human relations, every treaty, every jurisdiction claim, every war that's been fought over territory between our species. All of it would have to be reconsidered in light of the fact that we share a common ancestor and that the relationship was ongoing for thousands of years." She stood up. She paced short, tight arcs, the way the Veth moved when they were processing something that didn't fit their existing categories. He watched her and thought about how that motion had the same grammar as the way humans paced when they were overwhelmed, the same basic architecture of a body trying to metabolize too much information too fast. Same route, he thought, same old route. I need to think, she said. You don't have much time, he said gently. If Paztoth buries the record, the problem goes away for him. For me, it doesn't go away. For you, he paused. You falsified nothing. You ran the scan correctly, you documented the results correctly, you reported up the chain correctly. Everything you did was by the book. He's the one altering records. If this comes out later and you've stayed silent, you're complicit. If you act now, you're the physician who identified a legal anomaly and escalated appropriately. She looked at him. That's a practical argument, she said. I'm a practical person, he said. You're trying to survive. So are you, he said. I'm just being honest about it. She picked up the tablet. She held it for a moment, looking at the two genetic sequences side by side. Then she put it back in her sash. Return to the corridor, she said. I'll take you back. He went back. 2 more days. He was getting good at waiting. He told Ketch nothing. Not because he didn't trust him, but because the fewer people who knew, the cleaner the geometry of it. Ketch watched him with the particular attention of someone who has been in enough bad situations to recognize when something is shifting, when the weather is changing, when the thing that was stuck has started to move. You did something, Ketch said on the second evening. I'm a scientist, Marcus said. I observe. You observe with that particular look on your face that suggests you've already worked out where this is going. I haven't, Marcus said. That was mostly true. He could see the shape of it but not the resolution. There were too many variables he didn't control, what Ciel Varathon would decide, what Grell Paztoth had already done, what channels existed above Paztoth that hadn't been poisoned yet. He thought about the Veth sovereign line. He thought about a legal framework that predated the Directorate by 6,000 years. He thought about the fact that the Directorate, for all its administrative efficiency, was not a monarchy. It was a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies had superiors. On the morning of the 3rd day, everything changed. He heard it before he saw it, a shift in the sound of the facility, a change in the pitch of the humming that ran through the walls, and then voices in the corridor, multiple voices speaking over each other, and then the clicking of mandibles at a tempo he hadn't heard before. Not the bored clicking, not the anxious clicking, something else, the sound of people being very formally alert. Ketch sat up straight. What is that? Authority, Marcus said. The amber field went transparent, not dark, transparent, which he hadn't known it could do, and through it he could see the corridor filling with figures. Not guards, not the blue-gray of the medical corps. These were Veth in deep crimson, in configurations of 4, 8, and then more, and in the center of the formation was a figure that moved differently from everyone else. She was tall. The Veth Queen, not the political leader. The Directorate had 3 of those, but the holder of the sovereign designation, the keeper of the oldest bloodline, the entity whose authority predated every administrative structure currently in existence, was tall and old, and moved with the complete stillness of something that had never in its life needed to hurry. She stopped outside his cell. He stood up. He was, he thought, not afraid. He was past afraid. He'd moved through afraid and out the other side into something that was calmer and wider and felt, oddly, like curiosity. She looked at him with eyes that were opaque where Ciel Varathon's had been translucent, deep amber where the physician's had been pale, and the sustained eye contact she held was the kind that had weight. The Veth with her, administrators, advisors, guards, he couldn't tell them apart at this distance, were all very still. You are the human who carries the old marker, she said. Her translator was different from the others, older and more fluid. Standard came through it without accent, almost natural. Yes, Marcus said. Physician Third Varathon submitted a legal anomaly report to the regional directorate 3 days ago, the Queen said. The report flagged an irregularity in processing records and attached a complete genetic analysis. The regional director forwarded it to the Sovereign Office. A pause. I read it on the way here. Marcus said nothing. Administrator Paztoth, the Queen said, and she spoke the name with a flatness that said more about Paztoth's immediate future than anything else could have. Attempted to alter processing records for this facility over a period of 5 days. The alterations have been documented and will be addressed. Marcus still said nothing. The question before me, the Queen said, is what to do with you. Under your own law, he said, keeping his voice even, a holder of the sovereign line marker can't be detained without consent. I didn't consent to being brought here. No, she said. You didn't. A beat. There are those in my administration who argue that the law was written for Veth, that its application to a human detainee is without precedent, that the marker may be coincidental rather than meaningful. I have 3 years of data that argues otherwise, Marcus said. The marker isn't coincidental, it's structural. It's the same sequence because it comes from the same source. I can prove it. I know you can prove it, she said. I've read the preliminary findings on your consortium's public record. I am aware that you have not yet published the full work. I was 3 weeks away, he said, when your forces swept the Kepler corridor. The corridor was very quiet. The crimson-sashed advisors were motionless. Through the transparent field, Ketch was also motionless, and Marcus would later learn that every prisoner in every cell on that floor had pressed themselves to their fields to watch, silently, understanding nothing of what was said, but understanding the shape of the moment perfectly. You are 3 weeks away, the Queen repeated. The data is at Kepler 7, he said. In my lab, your forces have it or they've destroyed it or it's still sitting there waiting. If it's intact, I can finish the work. He paused. And when it's published, everything changes, not just for me. For every human and every Veth who has spent the last 4 centuries treating each other as strangers. She looked at him. He looked at her. The old blood between them was 400,000 years of separation, and underneath that, something much older, the same migration, the same route, the same long journey from the same starting point, branching into 2 shapes under 2 different suns. The sovereign line, she said slowly, has certain obligations. One of them is recognition. I'm not asking for recognition, he said. I'm asking for what your law already guarantees, release. And your research. And my research, he said, which, when it's complete, will have implications your administration will want to be on the right side of. She was quiet for a long time. The humming of the facility ran through the walls, the same mineral hum that had been there since the first moment, and Marcus stood in his cell and waited in the specific way he'd learned over 3 years. Not hoping, not calculating, just being present in the uncertainty and letting it do what it was going to do. Release him, the Queen said. Not to him, to the corridor, to the advisors and the guards and the infrastructure of authority that surrounded her. Release him and secure his research station. I want the drives intact and under sovereign custody, not directorate custody, sovereign. And I want Physician Third Varathon commended for her conduct. The amber field went dark. Marcus walked out of the cell. He stopped in the corridor and looked back. Ketch was standing at the edge of the field, which had come back up behind Marcus. He was looking at Marcus with the expression of a man who had been in bad situations long enough to know what deliverance looked like, and was trying not to get too much of it in his eyes. Marcus turned back to the Queen. The others, he said, the other humans in this facility, they haven't done anything. They're cargo haulers, farmers, survey technicians. They were in the wrong place. The Queen looked at him, then she looked at the cells. Detainees held without treaty designation, she said to her advisors, not looking away from Marcus. What is the current legal basis for their continued detention? There was a consultation, quick-clipped 3 advisors speaking over each other, then silence. The sweep authorization has expired, one of the advisors said. The tone was neutral, the kind of neutral that professional people use when they're acknowledging that something has been done wrong without quite admitting it. The corridor was reclassified to treaty-pending status 6 days ago. Continued detention without treaty authorization is irregular, another advisor said. Release them, the Queen said. It was that simple. 400 years of galactic geopolitics, and it was that simple, a word from the right person in the right room, and 34 humans walked out of cells and into a corridor and blinked at each other in the white Veth light. Ketch was one of the last ones out. He stopped next to Marcus and looked at the corridor full of people and the Veth in crimson and the Queen who had not moved. What the hell just happened? He said quietly. Science, Marcus said, mostly. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. They gave him a room, a proper room, with a window, looking out over whatever Veth settlement this facility was attached to. Low buildings on organic curves, amber light in the late afternoon, something growing between the structures that might have been vegetation. It looked a little like the planet he'd grown up on, in the way that everything looks a little like everything else if you've spent enough time looking. Ciel Verathon found him there, 2 hours after the release. She stood in the doorway. She'd changed out of the medical corsage, or someone had told her to, or she'd done it because the context of everything had changed. She looked younger without it, and also more herself, which was a thing he noticed. The commendation, she said. I didn't do it for a commendation. I know, he said. I did it because the data was accurate and the administrator was falsifying records, and I am a physician and my job is to document what I find accurately. She paused. And because it was the right thing to do. I know, he said again. She came into the room. She stood by the window and looked at the Veth city below. What you said in the consultation room, she said. About us being cousins. That's what the data shows. 400,000 years. 400,000 years, he said, give or take. She was quiet. The light was changing, amber going toward something darker, the shadows of the curved buildings stretching long across the street below. When I was a student, she said, there was a lecture, a historical lecture about the early contacts between Veth and humans, the first encounters before the Directorate, before the treaties. The lecture described humans as, she paused. The translation is approximate, something like the foreign mirrored ones. The ones who look as if they could be family but are not. Marcus looked at her. Foreign mirrored, he said. Yes. Someone knew, he said softly, or almost knew. Or half remembered. Maybe, she said, or maybe it was just an observation. You do look something like us if you don't look too closely. Or if you look very closely, he said, just at the blood. She turned from the window and looked at him with the direct, sustained eye contact that had started all of this. He met it. He was getting better at understanding what it meant. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't presumptuous. It was the Veth equivalent of a door held open. A recognition. An acknowledgement that something was being seen. Your research, she said, when you finish it, when you publish it. Yes. It will change things. That's the general idea, he said. It will be difficult, she said. Both sides will resist it. There are people on mine who have built careers on the framework that humans and Veth are fundamentally different, fundamentally separate, fundamentally in competition for the same resources. There are people on yours who have built the same careers in the same direction. The data will threaten all of them. Good data usually does, he said. She considered this. You're not afraid of that. I've been afraid, he said. I was afraid for 17 days in that cell. I was afraid they were going to disappear my research before I could finish it. I was afraid of being an administrative category, a census entry, a detainee with a number and no name. He paused. I'm not afraid of people who don't like inconvenient facts. That kind of opposition I know how to handle. She almost smiled. He was fairly sure she almost smiled. The Veth expressions were hard to read in the subtleties, but there was something in the set of her secondary limbs, a relaxation that felt like it had the same grammar. I would like to read the research, she said, when it is complete, if you are willing. I'll send you a copy before it goes to press, he said. You should probably be listed as a contributor, actually. You did catch the marker. I was doing routine intake processing. You ran the panel 3 times, he said. That's not routine. That's a scientist who doesn't trust a result she can't explain. I'd have done the same thing. She looked at him for another moment, with the open door look. Foreign mirrored, she said. Yeah, Marcus said. Something like that. The drives were intact. They brought them to him 3 days later, a sovereign courier, not directorate, crimson-sashed and formal, presenting a locked case with the kind of careful ceremony that in any species means we understand this is important. The seals were unbroken. He ran a hash check. Every file was there. He sat at the desk they'd given him in the room with the window, opened the analysis software, and went back to work. The ceiling of the room was curved, the way Veth ceilings always were, no right angles, all gentle arcs. The light was amber in the afternoon, the same amber as the detention fields, but warmer somehow, more alive. Through the window, the city moved at its own pace. Veth on errands, on conversations, on whatever the ordinary business of their days required. He watched them sometimes between sessions of data processing, watched the way they moved, the way they clustered in groups of 3 and 5 and 8, the way they used their hands, their secondary limbs, the small gestures that were completely alien and completely legible at the same time. He'd spent 3 years looking for the proof of what he suspected. Now he had it and beyond it, because the marker had worked the way it was supposed to work, because a young physician had run a panel 3 times and gone up the chain instead of staying quiet, because an old queen had read a report on the way here and decided that her law meant what it said. He also had time. Time and resources and a window looking out on a city of his 400,000 years distant cousins, going about their lives. He thought about what CL had said, about the resistance, about the careers that would be threatened, the frameworks that would have to be dismantled, the discomfort on both sides when the data came out. He thought about Ketch, who had been put on a ship back to the Kepler corridor with the other 33, who had shaken Marcus's hand in the way men shake hands when they don't know how to say what they actually feel, and who had said very quietly, "Whatever you did in that consultation room, don't stop doing it." He thought about 400,000 years of forgetting. He opened the data file. He went back to work. Outside, the amber light was doing what amber light does in the late afternoon everywhere, on every world, regardless of which ancient branch of the family tree you happen to be standing on. It went long and golden, and it made everything look, for just a moment, like it had been there forever, and would be there long after you were gone, warm and patient and waiting for someone to finally notice what had always been there. He noticed. He wrote it down. The paper published 8 months later, in every major xenobiological journal across human and Veth space simultaneously. The Sovereign Office released a statement the same day, 17 words. The Sovereign line acknowledges the findings of researcher Vale with interest and welcomes further collaborative study. 17 words from a 6,000-year institution that had never before acknowledged a human researcher's existence. The response was what CL had predicted, complicated, loud, politically difficult, resisted in some quarters with a vehemence that confirmed how much was at stake. 3 directorate administrators resigned. Two human politicians made speeches about the threat to established treaty frameworks. A Veth academic organization published a rebuttal within 72 hours that Marcus and his new colleagues took apart line by line over the following week. None of that was what he'd remember later. What he'd remember was a message he received the morning the paper went live, from a contact code he didn't recognize, which turned out to be a courier ID registered to the Sovereign Medical Office. No words, just the image of a genetic sequence diagram, two parallel sequences, the highlighted sections in amber, the identical markers sitting side by side like a reflection in water. He looked at it for a long time. Then he sent back a single word, "Cousins." The response came in 3 minutes. 3 words in plain standard, no translator required. "We remember now." He had not expected to like the Veth city. That seemed like an important thing to admit to himself, sitting at the desk in his window room on the 4th morning of his new semi-captivity. Because that's what it was, technically, a kind of comfortable custody, while the Sovereign Office worked out the administrative geometry of what to do with him. He was free, in the sense that no one was detaining him. He was not free, in the sense that there was a ship he was told to wait for, documentation that needed processing, formal designations that needed to be issued before he could move between sectors. He was, in other words, in bureaucratic purgatory. The Veth flavor of it was just warmer floored than the human flavor. He had not expected to like the city. He'd spent his career thinking about the Veth as a scientific subject, objectively, with the careful distance that good science requires. They were the species he studied, not the species he lived among. He knew their neural architecture better than most humans alive, could trace the mapped pathways of their collective memory structures with his eyes closed, had published 2 papers on the evolutionary pressures that had shaped their biology. He did not know, before this, what a Veth street looked like on an ordinary morning. It looked like a street, that was the first thing. The organic curves he'd observed in the detention facility were everywhere, but outside in the open, they read differently, less clinical, more alive. The buildings grew from each other in shapes that suggested something between architecture and geology, as if the city had been coaxed into being rather than built. Between them, narrow passages held what he now recognized as communal vegetation, something that looked like pale ferns pressed flat against the lower walls, something else that moved slightly in the air without any wind that he could detect. Market stalls in clusters of odd numbers. Veth moving through the passages in the 3 and 5 and 8 clusters he'd been watching from his window. He had a sovereign escort, 2 crimson-sashed figures who followed him at a distance that was respectful rather than controlling, close enough to assist, far enough to indicate that he was not a prisoner. Their names were Vel and Anoth Kaz, and they had been assigned to him with the particular formality of people carrying out an unusual order from a high authority, doing it correctly because they were professionals, and this was their job. He liked them. He hadn't expected that either. Vel was younger, and tended to answer his questions about the city with a precision that suggested deep personal investment in getting things right. Anoth Kaz was older, quieter, and had the habit of watching the street around them with the same steady peripheral attention that Marcus had learned to associate with people who had survived dangerous situations through observation rather than action. "The vegetation along the market walls," Marcus said, on the 3rd morning of his escorted outings. "Is it cultivated or incidental?" Vel answered immediately. "Cultivated. The variety along the lower markets is specifically chosen for air filtration. This district has a concentration of processing facilities in the sublevel, and the vegetation manages particulate load without mechanical systems." "Biological engineering," Marcus said. "We have been doing it for," Vel paused, a quick look at Anoth Kaz, "a long time." "Longer than the directorate," Anoth Kaz said quietly. Marcus looked at them both. The pause before Vel's answer, The completion from Anoth Kaz, the specific detail, longer than the directorate, registered not as information but as something slightly larger than information. A door, slightly open. What was here before the directorate? He asked. Neither of them answered immediately. A beat passed, too. The length of time that means the question has landed somewhere they're not sure they want to go, but also haven't decided to refuse. There are records, Vel said finally, in the Sovereign Archives, records from the progenitor period. Another pause. Most of them have not been translated into current Veth. They are considered archival. Archival, Marcus said. Old, Anoth Kaz said, with the tone of someone clarifying rather than dismissing. There are those who study them. It is a small specialty. The translation work is difficult because the written form from that period doesn't share its structure with current Veth orthography. Marcus kept his face neutral and his breathing even. The progenitor period. The period his research pointed to. The thousands of years of contact between the two populations before the roots closed, before the forgetting began. Has anyone connected those records to human language families? He asked. This time the pause was longer. It is not, Vel said carefully, a line of study that has been pursued to my knowledge. It should be, Marcus said. He said it simply, without emphasis, the way he said most things when he meant them completely. Vel and Anoth Kaz exchanged a look that he wasn't supposed to notice, but did the look of two people recalibrating slightly in real time, updating something internal, filing a thing away. He went back to the desk and wrote 3 pages of notes. Ciel came in the evening. She had been doing that, coming in the evenings, not every evening, but often enough that it had stopped feeling like a formal visit and started feeling like something else. They had developed, in the week since the release, a kind of shorthand that wasn't quite friendship and wasn't quite professional courtesy, and sat somewhere in the specific space that only exists between people who have been on opposite sides of a very sharp moment and survived it together. She brought a datapad this time, which was new. I went to the archive this afternoon, she said. He looked at her. Which archive? The Sovereign Archive. I have medical core access and under the new designation, she paused. Under the new designation, there is a provision for cross-disciplinary research access for credentialed specialists. I requested access to the progenitor period biological records. He set down his stylus. And he said. She set the datapad on the desk between them and turned it so he could see the screen. On it was a scan of what appeared to be a document, very old, the substrate clearly different from anything current, written in a script that was related to current Veth orthography in the way that old handwriting is related to a printed font. The same shapes, just rendered differently. She had translated a section. It sat below the original in current standard. He read it. He read it twice. The passage described, in the careful technical language of someone trained in biological documentation, someone, he thought, very like Ciel herself, the results of an examination conducted on a traveler from the other population, the one that had gone the other direction, the one that spoke a different arrangement of sounds but whose body, examined closely, showed the same structures, the same pathways, the same deep architecture. The writer of the document had noted this with the same precision that Ciel had used when she wrote up the anomaly report. The identical sequences, highlighted, the implications noted, carefully, without overreach. And at the bottom, a single phrase that the translator had rendered in standard with a bracketed note, indicating uncertainty about the exact register. Approximately, these are the ones who carry our oldest knowing in a shape we do not recognize. Marcus sat back. The room was quiet for a long time. 400,000 years ago, he said, a Veth physician ran a panel on a human traveler and wrote up the results. Approximately, Ciel said. The dating on the document is contested, but the period is consistent with what your research suggests. And this was in the archive. In the archive, uncatalogued in the sense that it had been logged but not indexed. It was filed under general biological census records from the progenitor period. She paused. There are apparently 12,000 documents in that classification. 12,000, he said. 12,000, she said. I read 14 today. 9 of them contain references to biological examination of what the writers call the other travelers. 3 of them contain sequence notations. She looked at him. I think some of the sequences may match your data. He looked at the datapad. He looked at the passage. At the careful, precise notation of a physician who had lived 400,000 years ago, who had looked at a human and seen what was there, had documented it with the same thorough instinct that CL had used when she'd run the panel 3 times. The same route, he said softly. The same route, she said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. I'm going to need access to the archive, he said. I know, she said. I've already submitted the request under the cross-disciplinary research provision. Given your current designation, I anticipate it will be approved. A pause. I would like to work on the translation with you. The progenitor period orthography is not a standard course of study, but I did learn it briefly during a period when I was considering a specialty change. You almost switched specialties. I considered it. I decided against it. The living are more interesting than the dead as a general rule. She looked at him. But in this case the dead may have something useful to say. He laughed. It surprised him. It surprised her too, from the slight shift in her secondary limbs. But it was genuine, the laughter of someone who has been in a very tight place for a long time and has suddenly found room. 12,000 documents, he said. At minimum, she said. Those are only the ones in the biological census classification. There are other classification categories I haven't requested access to yet. He picked up his stylus. He pulled the datapad toward him and looked at the old passage again, at the translated phrase at the bottom. These are the ones who carry our oldest knowing in a shape we do not recognize. 400,000 years. A physician looking at a traveler and seeing the blood and knowing, somehow, without the tools to prove it, that this was not a stranger. We're going to be here a while, he said. The Sovereign Office estimates the formal documentation process will take approximately 4 months, CL said. I mean longer than that, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, yes, I think so. He began making notes on the margin of the translation. She pulled up the next document on her own pad and began working through the orthography. Outside, the amber city went about its evening business, the curved streets slowly emptying as the light changed, the pale fern-like vegetation doing whatever it did when the temperature dropped, and 2 people sat at a desk with 400,000 years of forgetting laid out between them, and went about the slow, difficult, necessary work of remembering. The formal documentation came through on the 93rd day. A sovereign courier delivered it in the morning, a sealed case, crimson wax the Queen's mark. Inside was a single document, dense with Veth legal text that the translation program rendered imperfectly. The usual gap between what law says and what it means rendered slightly larger than usual by the fact that the relevant legal framework had last been applied 6,000 years ago, and the notations in the margins of the relevant statutes were themselves in need of translation. But the core of it was clear enough. Marcus Vale, researcher, xenobiologist, human, holder of the sovereign line marker, subject to the protections and provisions of the progenitor accord, free to move within sovereign-designated space without restriction, free to complete and publish his research under the protection of the sovereign designation. And this was the part that made him sit down and read it 3 more times, extended provisional researcher access to the complete sovereign archive, all classification categories, pending only standard credential verification. The archive, all of it. He put the document down on the desk and looked out the window at the Amber City. He thought about the data drives, now backed up in 4 separate locations. He thought about the 14 archive documents CL had read on the first day, and the 312 they had read together in the 90 days since. He thought about the publication draft that was now sitting at 11,000 words, 3 times the length of anything he'd ever written, and still not done. He thought about the progenitor period physician who had looked at a human traveler and seen the blood and known. He thought about Ketch, who had sent him a message 6 weeks ago, short, blunt, the style of a man who had a lot to say and had decided to say as little of it as possible because the rest was too large for a message. They're treating us different at the corridor checkpoint. Don't know what you did, but they're treating us different. Thought you should know. He thought about the things he hadn't known going into that cell. He hadn't known that the scan would find the marker. He hadn't known that a young physician would run the panel 3 times instead of once. He hadn't known that the marker would reach back 6,000 years and pass the directorate entirely to a law that predated every piece of bureaucratic machinery the Veth had ever built. He hadn't known that the data, sitting on encrypted drives in a ransacked lab, would survive intact. You go into uncertain situations not knowing which of the things you've done are going to matter. You can't know in advance. You do the work, you do it carefully, you do it honestly, and then you wait to see which part of it turns out to have been the right part. CL knocked on the open doorway. She had the datapad under one arm and a look on her face that he'd learned to read, not quite excitement, which was too loose a word for it, but the Veth equivalent of the specific alertness that comes when a line of work starts to resolve towards something. Archive access is going to take a week to process, she said. But I was talking to Vel this morning, and apparently there are physical specimens in the progenitor collection that haven't been cataloged at all. Biological samples. He looked at her. How old? He said. The collection has been dated to approximately the same period as the documents. She paused. If the samples have survived, the preservation conditions in that archive are apparently very specific. They may contain extractable genetic material. Marcus put down the document. Genetic material from the progenitor period, he said, from both populations. Potentially, she said. It hasn't been attempted. The technology for extraction from specimens of that age has only been viable for about 30 years, and no one has applied it to the sovereign biological collection because no one has had a reason to. Until now, Marcus said. Until now, she said. He stood up from the desk. He walked to the window. The Amber City was going about its morning business, the clusters of Veth moving in the narrow passages between the organic buildings, the pale ferns filtering the air, everything proceeding with the patient, orderly tempo of a place that had been here for a very long time and expected to be here for a very long time more. He thought about what it would mean. Physical genetic samples from before the split, the actual biological material of the progenitors, not inferred, not reconstructed, present, extractable, comparable to both his own blood and to the Veth sovereign line sequence. He thought about the paper and how it was going to need to be longer, much longer. We're going to be here more than 4 months, he said. CL came to stand beside him at the window. She looked at the city. I've put in for a transfer, she said. From the medical corps to the Sovereign Research Division. There is a new division as of 3 weeks ago, very small. 3 researchers and a budget that is, a pause, modest, but it exists. He looked at her. You started a research division, he said. I submitted a proposal, she said. The Queen approved it. The Veth expression for something like satisfaction, he had learned, was a particular stillness of the secondary limbs paired with a very slight elevation of the anterior posture. He saw it now. It required a name. I named it the Varath Vale Research Institute, pending your agreement. He laughed again, twice in 3 months, he was getting better at it. "You put my name first," she said. "Your name is first in the alphabet," he said. "It is not," she said, "in any alphabet I'm aware of." "Then I must have been thinking of a different system," he said. The secondary limbs went through the satisfaction motion again, slightly more pronounced. He filed the expression away for future reference. Below them, the amber city moved through its morning. The routes between the curved buildings carried their traffic of Veth going about their business. 400,000 years of history walking around on 2 legs without knowing what it was. Above the city, the sky was a color that had no standard name, not quite the sky color of any human world, not quite what the eye expected, something slightly off in a way that was not wrong, just other. He'd stopped noticing it as wrong about 3 weeks in. Now it just looked like the sky. That seemed, he thought, like a kind of progress. He turned away from the window and went back to the desk and opened the draft and found the place where he'd stopped the night before. The cursor blinked at the end of a sentence that he'd known when he wrote it, wasn't quite right yet, wasn't saying the thing he needed it to say. He read it again. He made 3 changes. He read it again. There it was. There was the thing. He kept writing,